right, well, why don't we begin with prayer? The Lord be with you.
And also with you.
Let us pray. Give us grateful hearts, O God, for the food that we have shared, for those who have prepared it for us, for those who will clean up afterwards. We ask that you will nourish our bodies and bless our souls. All this we ask in Christ's name. Amen.
Amen.
All right. Well, it's good to see everybody this evening. It's great turnout. Little technology challenge today, but I think we have, for most everybody can see this. I know there's folks probably on that side where this is all at an angle. I apologize, but I can email you this presentation if you like. It would be the pictures that are mainly accompany this with some text. Well, here we are, 4 nights of a Lenten journey with Thomas Merton, and we will go ahead and begin. When the Master of Novices, the teacher of the new monks at Our Lady of Gethsemane, a monastery of one of the most austere monastic orders in the world, with the intimidating name of the Order of Cistercians of the Strict Observance. When the Master of Novices asked the young monks to imagine, he asked them to imagine a young man lying on the floor recovering from a drunken stupor. And when he woke up and stared at the ceiling, he realized that his life had been changed by a conversion and by the certainty that he had a religious vocation. It is not recorded how these young monks reacted to such a scene, but some may have already been familiar with it because they had read a description of it in their novice master's autobiography, a book called The 7-Story Mountain. And some of those novices may have actually come to Our Lady of Gethsemane inspired and influenced by The 7-Story Mountain and other books written by their novice master, who in the monastery was known as Father Louis, but in the world he was known as Thomas Merton. That's who we have here today. And I would like to read to you a description of that person in their drunken stupor. And his, this is my copy of The 7-Story Mountain. It's still readable. So it's still in print. Yes, it is still in print. So this is what he says. He says, well, here, let me go to another slide. So here he is, young man, Thomas Merton, living in New York City. He had a number of friends from Columbia University. He was a graduate student at Columbia University, and he had some friends named Ed Rice, Bob Gertie, and Bob Gibney, and some young women who they knew who were involved in New York's theater and music entertainment industry. Reputable entertainment industry of New York City. And so this is just sets the stage for what he is going to describe. And this is just a few paragraphs. He says, one night, Rice and Bob Gertie and I went to Nick's on Sheridan Square, sitting at the curved bar while the room rocked with jazz. Presently, Gibney, and this is in 1939, this is a picture of New York City in 1939. There's some wonderful Kodochromes on the internet of New York City in 1939. That's Child's Bar, which is, I think, a well-known place at the time. But they're at Nick's on Sheridan Square. And it says that Gibney came in with Peggy Wells, who was one of the girls in that show at the Center Theater, the name of which I have forgotten. We all sat together at a table and talked and drank. It was just like all the other nights we spent in those places. It was more or less uninteresting, but we couldn't think of anything else to do, and there seemed to be no point in going to bed. Well, after Rice and Gertie went home, Gibney, Peggy, and I still sat there. Finally, it got to be about 4 o'clock in the morning. Gibney did not want to go out on Long Island, and Peggy lived uptown in the 80s. They came to Perry Street, which I think is in the Village, which was just around the corner. It was nothing unusual for me to sleep on the floor, or in a chair, or on a couch, too narrow and too short for comfort. That was the way we lived, and the way thousands of other people like us lived. One stayed up all night, and finally went to sleep wherever there happened to be room for one man to put his tired carcass. It is a strange thing that we should have thought of it, when if anyone had suggested sleeping on the floor as a penance for the love of God, we would have felt that he was trying to insult our intelligence and dignity as men. What a barbarous notion, making yourself uncomfortable as a penance. And yet we somehow seem to think it quite logical to sleep that way as part of an evening dedicated to pleasure. It shows how far the wisdom of the world will go in contradicting itself. I suppose that I got 5 or 6 hours sleep, and at about 11 we all were awake, sitting around disheveled and half stupefied, talking and smoking and playing records. The thin, ancient, somewhat elegiac cadences of the long-dead Bix Beiderbecke sang in the room, and from there I sat on the floor and I could see beyond the roofs to a patch of clear fall sky. At 1 o'clock in the afternoon I went out to get some breakfast, returning with scrambled eggs and toast and coffee in an armful of cardboard containers with my pockets full of new cigarettes. But I did not feel like smoking. We ate and talked and finally cleaned up all the mess. And somewhere in the midst of all this, an idea had come to me, an idea that was startling enough and momentous enough by itself, but much more astonishing in the context. Perhaps many people will not believe what I am saying. While we were sitting on the floor playing records and eating this breakfast, the idea came to me. I am going to be a priest. There you go. All right, so Thomas Merton eventually did go on to become a priest about 10 years later. It came about not as he imagined it at the time while lying there on the floor with, for all practical purposes, a hangover. He did become a priest of the order of Cistercians of the strict observance known as the Trappist, and he lived the last half of his life as a Trappist monk. The last 3 years living in a hermitage on the monastery grounds. He died in December of 1968 while attending a conference of monks and nuns in Bangkok, Thailand, after having traveled much of that last year of his life in California, Alaska, and Asia. Merton became famous as a Roman Catholic, as famous as Roman Catholic monks become, after the publication of this autobiography, The 7-Story Mountain, and he went on to write many, many other books. There's no way to put it other than to say that he was a prolific writer. He complained once when someone wrote to him to ask him to write an article for a magazine or journal. He complained and asked, did they think I secrete articles like sweat? But he did. This is just my bookshelf in my office of, I think there's 23 books on the top, and one of those is actually 7 books because it's a compilation of his 9 books of poetry. The shelf on there in the bottom is some biographies about him plus 7 volumes of his journal. So he was prolific. It is difficult to summarize all the sorts of things he wrote about, but they included meditations and essays on prayer, the Bible, spiritual direction, solitude, Zen Buddhism, theological anthropology, which is the man in relation, or humanity in relation to God, Christian mysticism, the Holy Eucharist, Gandhi, nonviolence, Eastern Orthodox religions or theologians, existentialisms, a couple of editions of his journals. He wrote a history of Our Lady of Gethsemane for the centennial celebration of that monastery. He had a vast correspondence. There are 5 volumes of his letters that he wrote to people. He kept a journal, like I said, that is 7 published volumes, those ones on the bottom right of that picture. He published 9 books of poetry. There was also a very thick collection of his literary essays. So not only did he have a vocation to be a monk, he had a vocation to be a writer. And that is something he struggled with throughout his life, that dual vocation of monk and writer. He thought the writer got in the way of his becoming a contemplative monk. And he says in the epilogue of his autobiography, I can find out which half. Yeah, I need some duct tape at 410. All right. He says in his epilogue, by the time I should have been delivered of any problems about my true identity, which is a common theme in his work, he said, I already made simple profession, and my vows should have divested me of the last shreds of any special identity. But then there was this shadow, this double, this writer who had followed me into the cloister. He is still on my track. He rides my shoulders sometimes like the old man of the sea. I cannot lose him. He still wears the name of Thomas Merton. Is it the name of the enemy? He is supposed to be dead. But he stands and meets me in the doorway of all my prayers and follows me into the church. He kneels with me behind the pillar, the Judas, and talks to me all the time in my ear. He is a businessman. He is full of ideas. He breathes notions and new schemes. He generates books in the silence that ought to be sweet with the infinitely productive darkness of contemplation. And the worst of it is, he has my superiors on his side. They won't kick him out, and I can't get rid of him. So, dual vocation. Well, in his journals, he was always resolving to cut down on his writing, always resolving to cut down on his correspondence, his writing projects, and things like that. And only a few entries later, he is, again, the businessman, making schemes, making plans for new articles, new essays, new poems, what have you. Especially early on in his monastic career, his superiors, meaning the abbot, encouraged his writing, and also had him writing biographies of important Cistercians of the past, and writing pamphlets on a variety of subjects important to the Cistercians. So, I think I've established that he was a writer and he was a monk. And so, and there are indications that he lived a rather bohemian lifestyle of a young writer in New York City in the 1930s, enjoying the nightlife of New York City. But why might we be interested in what Merton has to say to us today? Why read Thomas Merton? Well, I think there are several reasons, and this is just a quick list of these things, but I would also, there's these ways of putting it, but I would also put it in terms of three somewhat overlapping areas of the person and community is an issue important to him and I think important to us, God, prayer, and human identity, and then the Christian and the world. How does the Christian, or how does Christianity relate to the world, everyone else? Now, Thomas Merton, he lived and worked under a strict rule of life, under people to whom he owed obedience, absolute obedience to his superiors. One of the things he wrestled with, especially later in life, was especially when he became one of the leaders of the monastery himself and overseeing the novices, the new monks, then they were required to obey him. So he gave a lot of thought to this idea of obedience. He became a director of souls, and he also directed the souls of the monks, but also people of this vast correspondence. So, what did obedience mean within this context? And so he acknowledged the tension between the institution, the monastery, the institution of the church, as well as that tension with the individual person. Michael Mott, Merton's official biographer, he puts Merton's concerns this way, and I think they can concern us too. He says, what rules save the individual from self-obsession and blinding pride? What rules deny the individual his chance to be an individual? How could one tell the difference between a structure, an institution, a set of rules which concentrated the individual on a search for the true self, beyond the distractions of the false pride and a false self, and a structure, an institution, a set of rules that distorted or destroyed all sense of self? So how could one maintain one identity within a larger structure of an institution like a monastery, a church, a congregation? How can one be an individual but still be part of the institution? So in what ways do the governance, the boundaries, the rules that support the individual, who, as Paul says, is the Apostle Paul, is working out their salvation with fear and trembling. How are they working out their salvation? How do these very same things stunt or deform growth and the progress of the individual person? Merton, in the autobiography, acknowledged that the monastery was the four walls of his new freedom. He found freedom there, and we'll kind of talk about what that freedom was a little later. But he also came to see that the monastery did not necessarily lead to freedom. A reliance on the structure of monastic life itself could lead to a life of dependence on that structure without any sense of inward conversion. It became more about the path of conformity, which was an important topic to him, than the inward transformation of the individual person. Mott says that for Merton, there was never to be a complete answer to these questions that he raised. For us in our day, what rules do we have that save us from self-obsession and pride? we might say that it seems that we do not have any. And some folks might say that. In the age of the selfie, everybody knows what a selfie is, right? Yeah, everybody knows. So in the age of the selfie, what saves us from self-obsession and pride? In the age of Twitter, Facebook, Foursquare, Vine, Pinterest, and all the other forms of social media, when does self-expression become self-promotion? What rules do we have to help us shape and form our spiritual lives in the midst of all this? How can the church support and nurture the spiritual lives and help us engage the world without it becoming a venue, the church, becoming a venue for each of us to work out our psychological and or political agendas? Can the church, the Episcopal Church, provide a framework of belief and practice that honors the place of the individual conscience, while at the same time discerning what is a matter of what's essential and what is inessential, what's a matter of indifference? Thomas Merton lived during the part of his time in the early 1960s during the Second Vatican Council, which ran 61, 65, somewhere around in there. Some folks may remember that. And then during preceding Vatican II and following Vatican II was a time of monastic renewal. Merton had a definite hand in that. He was a person people sought out to learn about his thoughts on monasticism because he'd written about it and had some fairly good ideas about it. But during those years, it was a very trying time, not just for the Roman Catholic Church generally, but for monasticism as well. They were experiencing great exodus of people, of vocations. During the 40s and 50s, they had vast numbers coming fast, not millions, but a lot more than they had prior to World War II. But during World War II and following in those years, there had many folks coming to the monastery, in part due to Thomas Merton. Then those folks started to leave. And then you had the changes of Vatican II and other monastic renewal issues, and so there was a time of crisis. So, and you'll see why this time period for them would have been unsettling. And in a few minutes I'll provide a description of what monastic life was like when Thomas Merton arrived at the monastery, and you could probably see why this is an important issue and why there may have been need for change. So another area of concern was God, of course. Prayer and human identity. In the age of social media, who is our true self? Who are we? I mean, I know not everybody participates in social media, but I think it's a perennial question is, who am I? That's a question that Merton wrote a lot about and tried to figure out. So, who am I? You may have noticed that some people have a different online personality than they do in real life. That is my observation. Not all the time, but sometimes I've noticed some folks are different online than they are face to face. But in Merton's voice, in his works, he's not online, of course, but in his books, his writer's voice to me is much different than the one found in his journals. Read his journals. He's much more, fun, humorous, interesting in some ways, and his works published mainly in the 1950s they're not quite as they're harder to read. They're more dense. But which was the true Merton, the Merton of the journal, the Merton that was published during his lifetime. One of the ways I think Merton would encourage us to address this issue of who we are, who is this self, is through solitude and prayer. Solitude and prayer. He said that the true self is the one found in God through Christ. Prayer, he would say, I think, is one of the ways of sifting through the false selves that exist to find the true self in God. In his long essay called The Philosophy of Solitude, it came out in a book called Disputed Questions in 1959, he says there is a true self. There is a true self who comes to maturity of some sort. There is and can be no maturity. Unless one becomes empty and alone, he cannot give himself. He cannot give himself in love because he does not possess that deep self, which is the only gift worthy of love. And this deep self, he says, cannot be possessed My deep self is not something which I acquire, he says, or to which I attain after a long struggle. It is not mine and cannot become mine. It is no thing. It is no object. It is I. It is this I is Christ himself. So our deepest self is Christ himself, living in us and we in him, and all of us in the Father. So that's where he finds true identity is in Christ, who is in the Father. So this true self, this I in Christ, is in opposition to all these false selves that may exist. And he uses different terms that we're going to go into in a future session. We're going to go into what does all this stuff mean, but you have private self. These are all terms he uses. Smoke, illusory, individual, outward, imaginary, empirical, contingent, false, superficial, shadow, petty. These are the selves that we deal with most of the time. This is who we are, but not really who we are. There is more to us than that, I think he would say. He calls the false, he says the false self, the superficial, false social self, the image made up of the prejudices, the whimsy, the posturing, the Pharisaic self-concern, and the pseudo-dedication, which is the heritage of the individual in a limited and imperfect group. So we're going to work with this sort of idea later on, because it's an important one to him, and it shows him that's why he has so many descriptions of it in different ways. So solitude and prayer are part of the journey of discovering who one is, discovering our true self, our real self. Merton, though, did not really teach how to pray. I mean, if you read the books, not very often does he really teach how to pray. And actually, when he does, he himself found those works to be less successful, not in terms of sales, but of getting across what he was trying to convey than his other sorts of works that really set the stage for prayer. So he didn't really describe how to pray. He never really described how he himself prayed. Outside of, of course, liturgically, but what was his personal prayer life like? He never really describes in any of his published works, even though in the journals he does do that. So Martin did often not teach how to pray, and he was unsuccessful when he did so. But discovering our true selves, I think, is critical in this age of social media and just a media age. And we can lose ourselves through media, whether it's TV. And I'm going to go into that in a future session. Well, how does the church partake in this? Do we become part of? If we engage in some of these things, do we become part of that noise? Another institution marketing itself, trying to get people's attention, trying to be relevant, or can the church be the one institution or community that is not engaged in this, and perhaps might be a more authentic community, more trustworthy community? Those are questions to consider. And then lastly, the relationship of the Christian church to the world. How do we relate to everyone else? In his later writings, let's say the early 1960s, especially around 61, 62, Merton's attention turned, we could say, to the world. He really considered that he'd left the world in 1941 when he joined the monastery. But by 1958, 17 years into his time there, he rarely left Gethsemane, but he was able to do so in 1958, and he had sort of an epiphany when he went to Louisville, which is, I guess, the biggest city near where the monastery was. He recorded it in his journal, and he later reworked it for his book called Conjectures of a Guilty Bystander, which came out in 1966. But this event occurred March 19th, 1958. So the anniversary of this event is tomorrow, which is the Feast of St. Joseph, which was, for some reason, several significant events in his life happened on the Feast of St. Joseph. So this is the March 19th, 1958, standing on a street corner in Louisville where he had gone on an errand for the monastery regarding some printing project they were engaged in. And he recorded in his journal, and he said, "Yesterday in Louisville, at the corner of 4th and Walnut, I suddenly realized that I loved all the people, and that none of them were, or could be, totally alien to me. As if waking from a dream, the dream of my separateness, of my special vocation to be different from the rest, or just be in one special category, I realize I am still a member of the human race. And what more glorious destiny there is for man, since the Word became flesh and became, too, a member of the human race. I mean, it sounds like a rather mundane insight, actually, but for him at the time, when one reads the Seven-Story Mountain, you get the sense that he really had a great disdain for the world, and that's partly based on his own personal spiritual journey. Doesn't excuse it, but he definitely had some disdain for the world and thought the world was sinful, and especially other people were sinful as well. But here he realizes something that became important to him, really for the next 10 years. He continued to write on contemplation, which is a big issue for him, but his attention became to be directed towards peace and justice issues as well, especially non-violence. There it is, Faith and Violence. That's a book. That's kind of a compilation of different essays he wrote on the subject of faith and violence. Merton missed out on World War II. He joined the monastery 3 days after Pearl Harbor. There is no indication that I have read that he was avoiding service in any way. I wondered that because it did seem kind of convenient, but by all indications, he had already been to Gethsemane in April, had wanted to go back, and then in late November, early December 41, he was having a spiritual crisis, which resulted in him traveling by train there. But if he had been drafted for the war, he had planned to serve in non-combat roles if he could. He'd been kept out of the draft earlier because he didn't have enough teeth, which he thought was quite funny. But one of the things he talked about with his Columbia friends was what they would do if and when the war came. His brother Jean-Paul, Merton had a younger brother named Jean-Paul, who was a few younger than him. He served in the Canadian Air Force, joined up a year or two before the U.S. Became involved in the war. And he was shot down somewhere on his way back to England after a bombing mission and was buried at sea. And it makes for one of the more moving parts of the Seven-Story Mountain is when he finds out how what happened to his brother and then the poem he wrote for him. Well, some of the admirers of his earlier work thought Merton should just concentrate on those spiritual issues and not get involved with these more worldly spirit matters. Then when Merton did get involved in these issues, it was the 1960s, and there were a lot of issues to write about. Certainly there was Vatican II, but there was also Vietnam War, Cold War, and the other, especially the civil rights movement. Those became part of his concern, and it became part of the concern of the Roman Catholic Church as well. One of the documents of Vatican II is a document called The Church in the Modern World. So he wasn't addressing issues that the Church itself wasn't addressing. He was taking a stance that was generally in opposition to how most Catholics of the United States of America at that time felt about those issues or thought about those issues. So he took a different position on them. And I include this because I think it may be useful to think about how we locate the Episcopal Church and we ourselves in the wider world. What responsibility do we have as Christians to or with or for the world? Since the 1960s, the Episcopal Church has been involved in issues, and members of the church have reacted in a variety of ways to those issues. And we may ask ourselves what we have gained and what we have lost by doing so. Merton had no trouble himself being marginal on the outside, but should the church be an alternative voice and a way of life on the margins? But can we be part of the world? I mean, can we really separate ourselves from the world without getting our hands dirty, or are we always guilty bystanders? Ongoing question for us. And then related to the issue of the Christian in the world is the Christian in other religions, which was a big topic for him as well. Though he was very critical of Protestants in the Seven-Story Mountain, especially the Episcopal Church, and the minister he knew on Long Island, who was an Episcopal minister, he over time grew an appreciation for the Shaker movement, which developed in the general Kentucky area where he lived. Became acquainted with Anglican theology as well as Eastern Orthodox theology. But he, especially through his reading, came into contact with Zen Buddhism, which was a movement, really, not a movement, but in America it was a movement really of the 1950s and gaining interest in that topic. And there he found in Zen Buddhism similarities between his own monastic experience and that of the monks that he'd read about. He was allowed in 1964 to visit New York City. He hadn't been to New York City since 1941 probably. But in 1964 he was allowed to go to visit New York City and meet with the Zen scholar D.T. Suzuki, whom he had correspondence with. And Suzuki had helped popularize Zen Buddhism in America. And then in 1968 his abbot allowed him, a different abbot than the one that he struggled with, which I'll get into later, often struggled with. But in 1968, a new abbot allowed him to make a trip to Asia. And he met with a variety of folks, including the Dalai Lama, who was quite young then. Merton would have been probably 53 at the time. But he met with lots of other Hindu and Buddhist folks along the way in his time in Asia. And so I think he might have something to say to us about other religions as well. So those are some of the themes I hope to cover. And we're doing great on time. Goodness gracious, I was worried about that. So good. So these are some of the themes I hope to cover over the next 3 sessions that will comprise this Lenten journey with Thomas Merton. It is a work in progress. So it's like most journeys, there'll be some detours and digressions and some stops and starts, but hopefully we'll make it to the end of this. Thomas Merton was a prolific writer, like I said. I mean, he was a prolific writer. There's a lot of material, and I will not be able to do it justice. I can only provide just a little summary of what I think he had to say. And I think one of the things to keep in mind, and this is still what is just crazy, is he wrote all these books, wrote all these articles, wrote in his journal, and all at the same time he was praying 7 times a day, not just like, dear Lord help me, but these long services, in Latin, and he also had responsibilities as a teacher within the monastery, and he really only had 3 hours a day for his own work. So everything that he wrote, he had 3 hours a day to do, and by some accounts, he seemed like he was the most disorganized person at the monastery, but those who knew him say he was the most organized person at the monastery. So, other things to keep in mind. While he was, especially in the 60s, as he was engaging Zen Buddhism, controversial issues in the church and in society, he was doing it all as a fully invested monk, living under vows of stability, chastity, and conversion of manners. I mean, so he was living a thoroughly traditional, if not conservative, we could say, Christian monastic life. When he entered the monastery, the monks were still pretty much living the way they had lived for centuries, farming without machines, subsisting on a vegetarian diet, and engaging in prayer and worship for hours of the day, and living under a rule of silence. They didn't take a vow of silence, they just had a rule of silence, and they could talk to their superiors, they could talk to their confessor, and in emergencies they could use sound, but generally they had hand signals. One of them was, I think, thank you as you kissed your hand, and congratulations was doing this. Like you're a prize fighter is the way he described it. So that's how they communicated most of the time, and otherwise lived very silent, individual, for lack of a better word, individual lives. So now I'd like to turn away to a summary of how this monk who realized he was called to be a priest ended up, from the floor in New York City to Our Lady of Gethsemane in rural Kentucky, a place Merton knew as home for 27 years. So here we go. We got plenty of time to do this too, so I think so. Here we go. This is from the 7-Story Mountain, the first sentence or two. On the last day of January 1915, under the sign of the water bearer, in a year of a great war, and down in the shadow of some French mountain on the borders of Spain, I came into the world. Free by nature, in the image of God, I was nevertheless the prisoner of my own violence and my own selfishness, in the image of the world into which I was born. So this is just a brief summary timeline of his education. He was born in France. He spoke, I think, 4 languages at least, French, Spanish, Italian, English, and Latin, 5. And he had a pretty good working knowledge of German as well. His mother was from Douglaston, New York. That's where well, you can see he moved around. His mother died when he was about 6. He moved to France with his father, began school in England. His father died. He went to college in Cambridge. There is some thought that while he was at Cambridge, he was not a good student at all. He left after 1 year, and there's some indication that he may have fathered a child while he was a student at Cambridge, which is why he had to go to America. Some money, he had some money left in a trust that was given, according to some, given to the mother, and some people say that the mother and the child died during the Blitz of World War II. He never mentions it. He never wonders about that. I mean, I personally question whether he actually had a child, because he was such a, from my reading, an introspective person, and would have wondered in his journals about this child. But maybe not. I don't know. I'm not a Merton scholar. I'm an aficionado, I guess, of Merton. So, but he came to the United States, which is where his mother's family lived on Long Island, kind of where the U.S. Open tennis tournament is played in Flushing Meadows and Douglaston, right in that area. But he went to Columbia. He graduated from there with a bachelor's and a master's. He studied for his master's the poet William Blake. And he fell into a good group of friends that were friends with him for the rest of his life. Most of them were, not most of them, some of them are Jewish. And they stood with him when he was baptized at Corpus Christi Church, which is on the Upper West Side, I think south of where Columbia is. But he was baptized there after undergoing a gradual conversion experience, and I'll talk about that more as we go along next week more. And then he got a job teaching at St. Bonaventure College, which I see he's playing in the tournament, playing basketball. And then he entered Gethsemane on December 10th, and I think he died the same day, but 27 years later. This is Our Lady of Gethsemane. Doesn't that look like a great, fun place? It looks grim. It looks grim. So you take this intellectual person, but also a person that loved to have a good time. Go out. And this is where he goes, to Our Lady of Gethsemane, which is again in Kentucky. And he said of it in his journal in April after making a retreat there, he said at Easter time, "This is the center of America. I had wondered what it was holding the country together, what has been keeping the universe from cracking in pieces and falling apart. It is this monastery, if only this one." So he had a profound experience there at Gethsemane. This is it from above. It doesn't look like this now. They took the spire down and set it off in the woods and redid. During his time, they started redoing the main church. So that's it. And this is Our Lady of Gethsemane. It's founded in this time. It comes from France. It follows the rule of St. Benedict. It's the order of Cistercians of the strict observance, so they're observing the rule of St. Benedict strictly. The rule of St. Benedict goes back to the 400s. Benedictine monks, you may have heard of them. They follow the same rule, but not as strict as the Cistercians. But their life is characterized by prayer, penance, and work. That's what they did. Our Lady of Gethsemane and Cistercians at the time, it's not this case anymore. They're divided into choir monks and lay brothers. Choir monks, Thomas Merton was a choir monk, which means he participated in the full monastic liturgical services. The lay brothers provided more of the manual labor around the monastery and had their own separate services. They rose every morning at 2 a.m. Went to bed, 7 o'clock p.m. Rose at 2. They had these 7 services, and their days and weeks and years were punctuated by rosary, mass, procession, stations of the cross, Eucharistic adoration, all the stuff of pre-Vatican II Roman Catholic life in America. This is what it looked like on the inside. It actually extends back. You can't see it, but it comes towards us, and there's all the individual private altars, because every day the priests would do their own private masses and things like that, and they gathered once a day for communion together. So why did he choose the monastic life? Why did this guy who loved the high life, wanted to be a writer, and willing to give up being a writer, if he could, become a Roman Catholic Cistercian monk? Well, to shun the world and live as far as possible from what he perceived the corrupt life he lived before. To live a life of penance for those past sins. And when you read the biography or the autobiography, you're like, well, what did he do? What he did didn't seem so bad, because he doesn't mention a kid, or he doesn't really ever say what he did. So you're like, well, he got drunk. I mean, that's no big deal. I mean, Northgate, 6th Street, I mean, that's kind of life, So, I mean, that's it? That's what you're going to go join and do penance for because of that? And so, but, there apparently were other things that he was, I think, ashamed of that he doesn't mention or was not allowed to mention because he wrote under censorship. There is something called the imprimatur. Imprimatur, is that how you say that? That you said you had to have certain approval by your superiors and then their superiors and then like the bishop and then Cardinal Spellman in New York. And so he wasn't allowed sometimes to print what he wanted to print, especially in the case of the Seven-Story Mountain. But he also wanted to live a life of contemplation and prayer and praise. I mean, that was a topic that became important to he and his friends in the 30s at Columbia. He was the first kind of to go all the way in that direction, but he was followed by some of his friends, not into monastic life, but becoming members of the church, Roman Catholic Church. That's a picture of him as a young man. This is the second volume of his published journal. And so there's 3 phases to his life at Gethsemane. And let me just read a quick description of why did he give up that life to do these kinds of things. They slept in their habit. That was changed twice a year. It was washed once a month. They had the winter habit and they had the summer habit, and they were washed once a month. They shaved. The monks on the abbot side of the church would be shaved on Wednesdays. Monks on the prior side on Saturdays. And these are the only 2 days when hot water was provided. They used tin cans in the bathroom for drinking, but they're communal. They're converted tin cups used by the community. They used bicarbonate of soda for toothpaste. There were no bathtubs. There was a shower, and it was locked, and you had to have permission to use it from the abbot. You weren't allowed to have friendships in the monastery. There was, some reasons for that, but they didn't want particular friendships amongst monks in the monastery. And then this is to me, the harder thing to deal with. Not just the silence, because everybody's quiet, nobody talks, was you could communicate only 4 times a year by mail, at Christmas, Easter, August 15th, and All Saints. It was limited to 4 half-page letters on each occasion. 2 had to be sent to members of the family. All mail, incoming or outgoing, was read, usually by the prior, or in the case of the novices, the novice master. Mail could be received on those same 4 days, though Christmas and Easter were thought to be days of recollection, and mail was usually given out the day after. And then they had this vegetarian diet. And the meat was provided for the sick. One person complained that they were given sweet potatoes every day for a year. And if you didn't like sweet potatoes like me, then I guess you're out of luck. And it said that, about obedience in the monastery, Dom Frederick, the first abbot that Merton knew, said that he had 2 basic rules to the community. Do what you are told, and do what you are told. And when he became abbot, Dom Frederick, he said that among his first acts was to abolish the Easter morning treat of 2 fried eggs as needlessly extravagant. So that's life in the monastery. That's what Merton chose or felt called to. And so this is his life there. 3 phases. The early phase where he's just this die-hard. He was a rather new convert when he joined the monastery. He only convert for about 3 years when he joined the monastery. So he's die-hard about this stuff at that time. But he saw the publication of his autobiography. Like I said earlier, he was ordered to write, and he was not just ordered, but also given permission for some projects like the Seven-Story Mountain. But he'd started an autobiographical novel prior to his entry, but then turned it into an actual autobiography. He was ordained May 26, 1949, I think, Feast of the Ascension. Themes, Could he be a contemplative and a writer at the same time? Was that even possible? He felt at that time the writer kept getting in the way of the contemplative. Or should he leave and join the Carthusians for more solitude? If you have Netflix, there is a movie on Netflix, a documentary, 3 hours. It's called Into Great Silence. And if you go to Netflix and look up Into Great Silence, it's a 3-hour documentary about the Carthusians. They have a rule of silence, but they don't meet communally. Most of their week is spent in their own cell, their own room where they pray by themselves and meet together just a couple of times a day to pray together. And then once a week they gather for conversation outside. So if you want to spend 3 hours watching a movie that has almost zero talking, but very beautiful images of that monastery, which is in France, in the Alps, it's not a bad way to spend 3 hours. But I don't think my boys like watching it very much. Well, I sure like that movie. But it's good. But it's called Into Great Silence. But that's what he was tempted to leave. He was tempted to go for more silence than he was already getting. And one of his biographers really indicates maybe it wasn't silence that he was really looking for, but privacy. Because everything was communal. They slept in the same room. Everything was done together. So maybe what he was not really looking for was silence, but some sense of privacy. So here he is as somewhat older. And so this is the middle period when he was the master of scholastics, which he taught the students for the priesthood. But he wrote a series of books that are, The Sign of Jonas is a good place if you're looking to where to start. Don't want to commit to the autobiography. Sign of Jonas is one of his journals, sort of not reworked too much, but edited to some degree by him and published in 1952. And so it's divided by days, and so it's very, very short chapters per se. Nomana Island is a little more dense. I've never been able to make it through Nomana as an island. But he was also the master of novices in 1955 and held that position until 1965 or so, maybe a little later than that. Another good place to start, a much shorter book, is Thoughts in Solitude. It's one of the first books after The Seven-Story Mountain I read by him. And his areas of interest were Eastern Orthodox thinkers, Latin American poets. He could speak Spanish and read Spanish, and there was several Latin American people from Latin America in the monastery, including a poet. And he's also got interested in Zen. Yeah, I'll skip that. Okay. And here he is, older. And so the final phase and the Asian journey. New Seeds of Contemplation is a great book. It's 4 or 5 pages a chapter. And so it's another good place to start. It's actually a revision of a book called Seeds of Contemplation, which he wrote in the late 1940s. Ostensibly, there was a building built on monastery grounds that would become a conference center. But through time, it actually turned into his hermitage. I don't think he actually planned it that way. It just kind of turned out that way. I think to his great satisfaction that it turned out that way. But the hermitage was built. He was allowed to move to it permanently. He got to spend more and more time there through the years until he could permanently move there in 1965 after he retired as the master of novices. He published Conjectures of a Guilty Bystander. And then one of the more interesting things, in 1966, he fell in love with a woman, a nurse, after going for back surgery. He was a very unhealthy person, and he's always ill, bursitis, and just stomach issues and skin issues and back issues. But he fell in love with a woman that nobody knows her real name. Some people do, but it's never been published. But he fell in love. He came close to breaking that vow of chastity if he didn't. I guess that's between him and the confessor, whoever his confessor was. But 1966 was a tumultuous year for a person that wrote a number of books concerning love to actually fall in love, and a person fall in love with him after, I think he considered himself mishandling occasions when people did love him, he didn't love them back. This was a sort of it's kind of a funny part of the journals to read, just because he acts like he's about 17 and trying to get away from his dad, who in this case is the abbot, by finding, because he didn't really have access to a phone, so he had to use tricks to talk on the phone, and it's kind of funny but kind of sad at the same time for both of them. And then that situation was resolved, and a new abbot was elected. The old one retired, and he was allowed to make a trip. He was allowed earlier to go to New York, but he was allowed to make several extended trips to California, Alaska, and then finally to Asia. And at that time he released a book called Zen and the Birds of Appetite. And then in 1968, December 10th, he died in Bangkok, Thailand, where he had spoken at a meeting of Asian Benedictines and Cistercians. He had finished giving his talk, which had something to do about monasticism and communism. Being a topic, the war going on and everything like that. But he went back to his room to take a rest, take a shower. He took a shower. This is what they think, piecing it together. Took a shower, came out, wearing a towel. There's these big fans, and he probably picked up the fan, a metal fan, and to move it, and it electrocuted him. Or he electrocuted him and he had a heart attack, just one of those things. But they think it's due to that being electrocuted that he died. He was 53. It would have been interesting to see what he would have to say about the changes of Vatican II. John Paul II, to see what that would have been like would have been interesting. But these are his areas of interest: peace, nonviolence. He went through a big Camus phase, the existential novelist and philosopher. Also monastic changes. Took photographs. Somebody sent him a camera. He was given a lot of leeway you can see it, during his time in the monastery. It changed a great deal. Partly because he was there. Partly because he was who he was, and he was given a lot of leeway to have visitors, authorized and unauthorized, as well as do other things, correspondence and all stuff like that. Those rules didn't apply to him, but during most of his career there. But what's the role of the hermit in society? Who am I to? One of the questions you want to know is how can I'm not involved in any of these things going on, but can I still provide some insight into what's happening in the world from my vantage point as not being involved as much as some of the activists were? But he was involved with peace activists at that time. But what was his role? What could he do? And then, of course, Eastern religions was an ongoing concern. That's the Hermitage, taken, I think he took that picture. It's not very fancy. It looks better on the inside. It looks better in color too. But it looks like it's just like a cinder block, one of those roofs, those metal roofs on it, I think. A chapel was added near the end of his time there. So he could celebrate Mass there eventually. And there he is, prior to his Asian. That's like the day he left Gethsemane, ready to go with his camera, with his books, with his journals, and he kept buying more books along the way, and just had a issue with that. So that's kind of an overview of who this person is. I mean, who's read Thomas Merton? That's a good amount. I'll just tell you how I'll close up on this, because he's a very important person in my life. I mean, he would hate it. He wouldn't hate it. He had a complicated relationship with the seven-story mountain because he thought it was a snapshot of who he was at one time. He was not that person ever again. I mean, he, of course, had been that person and was related to that person, but he never disowned that book, but he always wanted to kind of hold it away. And one of the things he really did not want to hear people tell him was that, oh, your autobiography really changed my life. He did not really want to hear that, even though it did for me. I mean, it definitely changed my life. And I heard about him by reading a book of history of Buddhism in America. It talked about this Roman Catholic monk who had been a New York City artist type, intellectual type, who became a Roman Catholic monk, who got interested in Buddhism. And so I went back and found the Seven-Story Mountain at Walden Books and in Austin and read it. So a very important person. I don't know if I'm a priest because of him, but he certainly helped bring me back to my own time of spending time on 6th Street and doing things like that in Austin. So a very important person to me, and I hope we'll just be able to convey a little bit of what he, I think, represents, but also what he said, because I think it's important to us even now. So thank you all very much. It's great to see everyone, and I hope to see you again next week.